So, I want you to think for a second about how we, culturally tend to interact with ancient texts,
Hmm.
specifically sacred texts.
Right, yeah.
Because regardless of the specific tradition you look at, there is this almost um, universal gravity
Yeah.
pulling us toward what I like to call the ritual trap.
The ritual trap, I like that.
Yeah, like you open the book, you recite the verses, maybe in a language you barely even understand,
Yeah.
and you just expect this sort of passive, ethereal comfort to wash over you.
Right, you're treating the text like a spiritual safety blanket.
Exactly. It's supposed to soothe your anxieties or maybe guarantee you some abstract and visible points for the afterlife.
Hmm.
But crucially, it is not expected to interfere with your actual day-to-day reality. I mean, you don't read it expecting it to dictate how you structure your municipal tax code, right?
No, definitely not. Or how you engineer a bridge.
Yeah. Or how you establish a constitutional succession plan for a government. It's just, it's kept separate.
It is entirely treated as a metaphysical transaction. You perform the vocal ritual, and in exchange, you receive a feeling of sanctity. The engagement is fundamentally contained.
Contained. Yeah, that's a good word for it.
And well, there is a very practical reason humanity gravitates toward that containment. I mean, if a text is merely a mystical placeholder sitting on a velvet cloth on your highest bookshelf,
It demands absolutely nothing from your intellect.
precisely, it doesn't require you to audit your socioeconomic systems. But the moment you transition from viewing a text as a mystical placeholder to viewing it as a civilizational blueprint, well, everything changes.
Right, because blueprints are inherently demanding.
They are. They require grueling physical execution. They need mathematical precision and absolute accountability.
And that transition, that pivot from passive ritual to aggressive, systemic execution, that is the exact mission of our deep dive today.
It's going to be a fascinating one.
It really is. We are pulling from a fascinating stack of source material today, the lectures of Allama G.A. Parwez, specifically his rationalist commentary on Surah Al-Imran from the Quran.
Right.
Now, before we really dive into this, I want to establish a clear baseline with you, the listener, because whether you are coming to this from a secular academic background or a deeply religious one, or honestly somewhere entirely in between.
Which many people are.
Exactly. Our goal today is not to champion a specific theology. We're not taking a political side, left or right. We're here acting purely as impartial guides.
Right, we're just analyzing the mechanics of Parwez's arguments.
Just the mechanics, because frankly, whether you agree with his theological premises or not, the structural, socioeconomic framework he extracts from this text is, it's an absolute masterclass in systemic thinking.
It really is.
It forces you to look at historical decline and societal survival through a completely ruthless logical lens.
It's a fascinating structural audit of human society because the core conflict Parwez is highlighting here is the profound historical tension between passive fatalism,
Which is everywhere.
right, this idea that our destinies are pre-written in some cosmic ledger and we're just actors playing out a script. He contrasts that with active, supreme human agency.
So he's saying the text is against that fatalism.
Exactly. He argues that this specific text is actively working to shatter the paralyzing ideology of predestination. He replaces it with a rigorous framework where societies rise, dominate, or utterly collapse based entirely on their adherence to immutable, objective physical and social laws.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a massive intellectual pivot. You're moving from waiting around for arbitrary supernatural interventions to actively mastering the cold mechanics of the universe.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to make that pivot, we have to fundamentally recalibrate our vocabulary.
We do. We have to strip away the ethereal definitions.
Right. If we are moving from mysticism to mechanics, we can't use mystical words anymore. And the first linguistic key we need to decode from the source material is the Arabic term, Deen.
Yes, Deen. This is crucial. How a society defines this single concept effectively dictates their entire trajectory of scientific and economic progress.
Really, just one word.
Just one word. Because the traditional Orthodox interpretation of Eden translates it as God's momentary arbitrary permission.
Meaning that the universe is essentially run on a system of real-time micro-approvals.
Exactly.
The classic theological trope, right? That not a single leaf falls from a branch without God explicitly, in that exact millisecond, issuing a localized decree permitting that specific leaf to detach.
Right. It's a universe of constant micro-level intervention. Every drop of rain, every gust of wind, every cellular division is a localized, customized miracle.
Okay, but Parwez pushes back on that.
He does. He applies a purely rationalist lens to the text and argues that this interpretation is fundamentally flawed. In fact, he says it's anti-intellectual.
Anti-intellectual.
Yeah. Because in his framework, Gaiden does not mean arbitrary real-time permission. It translates to God's standing orders.
Standing orders, like military protocol.
Exactly. It represents the immutable, unbreakable physical laws of nature. So the leaf doesn't fall because of a daily, customized, divine decree.
It falls because of gravity.
Gravity, cellular degradation, wind resistance, the established, unyielding physical laws that govern the cosmos.
Okay, but wait, let me push back on that for a second, because there's a profound psychological cost to that redefinition, isn't there?
How do you mean?
Well, if God is no longer a micromanager who can intervene in real time, but rather, let's say, a brilliant software engineer who wrote an unbreakable physics engine for the universe,
Right.
doesn't that strip away the entire emotional comfort people seek in religion? I mean, if the physics engine is cold and unchangeable, how does this framework address the human desire to pray for an exception when things go wrong?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
No, it completely invalidates the concept of praying for an exception, and that is exactly the point Parwez is making. He argues that seeking an exception to a physical law is actually an insult to the perfection of the design.
Because it implies the design was flawed to begin with.
Exactly. Think about your software engineer analogy. If the engineer had to constantly pause the simulation to manually fix the gravity because a ship was too heavy and about to sink.
It would mean the original code was garbage.
Right. The rationalist view is that the idlen, the code is flawless. Therefore, your interaction with the divine changes. You stop begging for an arbitrary suspension of the rules, and you dedicate yourself to understanding and mastering those rules.
Man, that completely re-engineers human behavior. It means ships float not because of daily miracles or, because the people on board are sufficiently pious.
Exactly.
It's strictly because the ship was engineered in mathematical adherence to the physical laws of buoyancy.
Yes, if you overload a cargo ship and it sinks, it isn't because God was angry with the captain's theology that day. It's because the captain violated the Ayat, the law of mass and displacement. The physics engine simply executed its standing orders. It is pure cause and effect. You follow the rules of the physics engine, you achieve your desired result. You break them, you suffer the consequence. It is not supernatural punishment, it's
just math.
It's just math. And this predictability, what Parwez actually calls a permanent value in the text, is the exact feature that allows human intellect to flourish.
Because if the rules kept changing, you couldn't build anything.
Right. If gravity took a day off depending on divine mood, you could never invent aviation. You could never build skyscrapers. It is the unchangeable consistency of the Ayat that allows human beings to transition from a primitive state of fearing nature to a state of scientific subjugation of nature.
Which democratizes success in a really brutal, objective way. I mean, it means the soil doesn't care if you're praying over it. The idea of agriculture demands specific nitrogen levels, specific water volume, and specific sunlight.
And if you provide those, the seed grows.
And if you don't, you starve. Theology aside.
Yeah.
Now, if the physical universe, ships, seeds, gravity, operates on this strict software code, how does this apply to the human body? Because the outline introduces another critical term here, ajal, or kikaban muajala.
Yes. This is where the framework launches a direct assault on deeply entrenched, paralyzing cultural beliefs.
Because ajal is usually tied to fate, right?
Traditionally, yes. Ajal has been wrapped up in the concept of takir, or strict predestination. It is commonly understood as a rigidly fixed, inescapable date of death pre-written by God for every individual.
Right, the very common when your time is up mentality. Like you look both ways, you cross the street perfectly, but a drunk driver hits you, and society comforts itself by saying, well, it was just his time, it was written.
Exactly, that's the traditional view. But Parwez takes the definition of kitab, which implies a law, a prescription, or a code, and connects it to ajal, which means a scientifically determined interval or period.
A scientifically determined interval.
Yes. So in this rationalist framework, ajal does not mean a mystical expiration date stamped on your soul before you were born. It refers to a biological lifespan based entirely on physical cause and effect.
Wait, really? So human aging and mortality are just like another subroutine in the physics engine?
Exactly. Think of it like water boiling. Water boils at a certain temperature over a certain time based on applied heat. The human body degrades over a certain time based on biological laws.
But if it's based on cause and effect rather than a pre-written destiny, I mean, does that mean a society can actively manipulate its own ajal?
That is the radical, world-shifting conclusion of this text. Yes. Because lifespan is governed by physical laws, a society's average ajal can be actively increased or decreased based on their scientific literacy.
That's incredible.
The source material argues that if a population discovers and adheres to the physical laws of hygiene, nutrition, epidemiology, and cellular biology, they will practically extend the lifespan of their citizens.
So building a robust public healthcare system, funding medical research, maintaining clean water infrastructure, these aren't just secular administrative tasks in this view.
Not at all.
In this framework, mastering medicine is a literal systemic duty.
Yes.
By extending human life through science, you aren't somehow cheating death or, defying God's will. You are perfectly executing God's physical laws. You are utilizing the Inan to maximize the ajal.
Precisely. And contrast that with what the sources describe as the Persian-imported ideology of fatalism, or job. Yeah. The text suggests that historically this idea of a fixed, inescapable fate was often weaponized by despotic rulers and empires to paralyze populations.
Well, that makes total sense from a political control standpoint.
Instant.
Yeah. I mean, if you were an autocrat
Yep.
and your population is dying of cholera because you refuse to build proper sanitation infrastructure,
Yeah.
you have a massive political problem on your hands. The people might rebel. But if you can fund a theological class to convince the peasants that cholera is simply God's pre-written igal for them, and that trying to cure it is interfering with divine will.
You completely neutralize the rebellion.
Exactly. You outsource your political failure to God.
It is the ultimate abdication of systemic responsibility. Fatalism breeds profound inaction. I mean, why build hospitals if everyone's exact second of death is immutably fixed?
You wouldn't.
But Parwez's reading of Surah Al-Imran strips that excuse away from leadership. If God's will manifests as objective, conquerable physical laws, then human agency is absolute.
So if your population is dying of preventable diseases, it is not God's mysterious plan.
No, it is your society's failure to master the IDN. You are responsible for your own biological survival.
Okay, so if individual biological survival is dictated by mastering these physical laws, then it naturally follows that the collective survival of a society, like its economy, its labor force, its resource distribution, must be governed by the exact same mathematical predictability.
It has to be. The macro reflects the micro.
Which leads us directly into the economic engine of this framework, what Parwez calls the Nizam-e Rububiyat.
The system of providence.
Right. And to understand how this economy functions, we have to completely redefine one of the most common words in the religious lexicon. Sawab.
Ah, yes. Sawab. It is perhaps the most egregious example of a systemic term being reduced to the ritual trap we discussed earlier.
It really is.
In common parlance, sawab is almost universally viewed as spiritual currency.
Spiritual currency. I always think of it treated like a completely useless cryptocurrency that you can only cash out after you die.
That is a brutally accurate analogy.
Right. You recite a specific phrase 100 times, and an angel deposits 100 units of sawab into your celestial bank account.
But it has absolutely zero purchasing power in the physical world.
None. It doesn't feed your children. It doesn't pave your roads.
It is entirely detached from physical reality. But the source material drops a bombshell here. In Parwez's rationalist lexicon, sawab is not ethereal at all. It is a strict, grounded, socioeconomic business term.
A business term.
Yes. It literally translates to return on investment, or ROI.
Wow.
It is the tangible, measurable, physical result of human labor, time, intellect, and capital.
So sawab is a dividend.
Exactly. When you exert effort into the system, the tangible output you generate is your sawab.
And the text divides this into two distinct categories, right? Sawab ad-dunya and sawab al-akhirah. Let's break those down. What exactly is sawab ad-dunya, the worldly return?
Sawab ad-dunya is the immediate physical return a society gets when they successfully master the physical laws.
Okay, so give me an example.
If you build superior agricultural technology, your sawab ad-dunya is a massive crop yield. If you develop advanced metallurgy, your return is superior infrastructure and military defense.
Makes sense.
And here's where Parwez highlights a brilliant, deeply challenging concept regarding the equality of physical law.
Which is?
The physics engine of the universe is completely blind to theology. It does not distinguish between a mu'min, a believer, and a kafir, a non-believer.
That is a staggering point. It means the universe offers no inherent systemic privilege to, the chosen people.
None whatsoever. The physical laws demand adherence, period. As we established, the soil doesn't ask for a statement of faith, it asks for water and fertilizer.
So the ROI is purely mechanical.
Exactly. The lecture uses this exact agricultural analogy. If a non-believer sows a seed and meticulously follows the physical laws of agronomy, they will reap an abundant harvest. They will secure their sawab dunya.
And what if a believer does the opposite?
If a devout believer ignores those same laws, if they just sit in the dry dirt and rely on their passive rituals, they will face starvation.
Because the physics engine doesn't care about their rituals.
Right. A Hindu, a Muslim, an atheist, and a Buddhist must all take the exact same chemical compound to cure a specific bacterial infection.
So a purely secular society with exceptional scientists and engineers will mathematically outpace and dominate a highly religious society with poor scientists.
Mathematically, yes. Worldly dominance goes strictly to whoever masters the physical laws.
But wait, if that's the case, if Sawabu Dunya goes strictly to whoever builds the best technology, how does this system prevent pure, unbridled exploitation?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because in our modern world, we see corporations master physical laws every day. They build incredible logistics networks, AI, mass production, but they hoard the wealth, they exploit the labor force, and they destroy the environment. If the non-believer can just build a better factory and win, where does the moral or systemic sustainability come in?
That is the exact bottleneck that the second type of return, Sawabu Akhira, addresses.
Oh, okay.
Now, Akhira in this context doesn't just mean a mystical afterlife. Parwez argues it means the future, the long-term systemic sustainability of the society. Yes, the text argues that if a society masters physical laws to attain immense power, so they get the Sawabu Dunya but they act oppressively, if they engage in capitalist hoarding, if they steal the later value of their working class, they will achieve temporary dominance. But eventually, inevitably, that society will collapse from within due to extreme wealth disparity and social unrest.
Because it is mathematically unsustainable to oppress the foundation of your own economy. You might have the best physics engine, but if you starve the people running the machines, the factory burns down.
Exactly. So to achieve Sawabu Akhira, which is permanent, multi-generational, systemic sustainability, a society must do two things simultaneously.
Okay, what are they?
First, they must ruthlessly master the physical laws to generate the wealth. They have to get the dunya part right.
Right, you can't distribute wealth you haven't created.
Precisely. And second, they must regulate the distribution of that wealth through permanent, objective social values. Chief among those values is adal, or justice.
So it's not enough to just maximize the GDP. You have to distribute the ROI justly.
Yes.
And that brings in the role of the markaz, the central authority within this nizam rububiyat. Because if sawab is pure ROI, the immediate threat is that powerful individuals will try to siphon off the ROI generated by weaker individuals.
It's human nature.
Right. So how does Parwez envision the markaz solving that specific bottleneck without just becoming like a tyrannical communist bureaucracy?
It's a delicate balance. The markaz in this framework operates on a strict principle of meritocracy and anti-exploitation. Its primary constitutional duty is to ensure that every single individual receives their exact sawab, their exact return on investment, for the labor they exerted.
So it's an auditor.
Essentially, yes. It is designed to structurally eliminate unearned privilege, monopolies, and the hoarding of capital. If you exert physical or intellectual effort, the markaz mathematically guarantees your access to worldly prosperity.
So it serves as the ultimate auditor of the social contract.
Yeah.
It ensures that your labor cannot be stolen by a feudal lord or a corporate monopoly.
Exactly.
And presumably, through the principle of adl, or justice, it also ensures that those who are biologically incapable of generating labor, like the elderly or the disabled, are sustained by the surplus of the system.
Yes, because the overarching goal is the biological security of the entire millat, the collective community. The system of rububiyat literally means a system of universal nourishment and development. It is a clockwork, socio-economic engine. You have a predictable physical universe governed by Idun. You have biological agency governed by Agal. You have an economic engine driven by measurable ROI, sawab, which is regulated by the markaz to ensure absolute justice.
It is a stunningly cohesive, rational architecture.
It really is.
But every architecture looks perfect on paper.
True.
The real question is, What happens to this flawless clockwork system when it experiences a catastrophic real-world stress test?
Right. What happens when the pressure is applied?
Exactly. Specifically, what happens when the visionary architect of this system, the person actually running the Markaz, is suddenly removed from the equation?
Hmm.
Because leaders are biological entities. They are subject to ajal. They die.
And that biological vulnerability is the ultimate existential threat to any nascent civilization. I mean, do the constitutional principles survive the death of the founder, or was the entire movement just a cult of personality?
Which brings us to one of the most dramatic historical case studies analyzed in the source material, the Battle of Uhud.
Yes. Surah Al-Imran, verses 144 through 150.
Let me set the cinematic stage for the listener here, because this is intense. The early Muslim community is engaged in a brutal, chaotic, hand-to-hand military conflict at Uhud. The structural integrity of their new socioeconomic order is entirely on the line. And in the absolute fog of war, amidst the panic and the casualties, a rumor suddenly detonates across the battlefield.
The rumor that Prophet Muhammad has been assassinated.
Right.
You have to try to comprehend the profound psychological devastation of that moment for those soldiers. The leader, the central node of the Markaz, the architect who is revealing this entire revolutionary system, is believed to be dead.
Just wiped out in an instant.
Yes, the community is instantly plunged into an acute structural crisis. The psychological weight is crushing. Do they drop their weapons? Do they flee?
Does this entire experiment in socioeconomic justice instantly dissolve back into the tribal, exploitative capitalism they had just escaped?
Exactly. And how does the text functioning as this living, breathing civilizational blueprint respond to this exact terrifying moment of existential doubt?
How does it?
It responds with verse 144, and it does so with absolute clinical detachment.
No sentimentality.
Zero sentimentality. The text explicitly states that Muhammad is a messenger, and like all humans who came before him, he is fully subject to the same biological laws of life and death ajal. He is not a supernatural entity exempt from the physics engine. He is going to die.
Wow. So the text uses the chaos of the battlefield to finalize the social contract.
It does.
It is essentially grabbing the community by the shoulders and saying, what did you think was happening here? It establishes that the relationship between the Malatta community and the Markaz, the central authority, must be anchored strictly in a permanent ideological system, the Deen.
Right. It cannot, under any circumstances, be based on personality worship.
The system must outlive the biology of its founder.
The constitutional principles are permanent even if the executive is temporary. The text forces a brutal question on them. If the community uses the rumor of the leader's death or his actual eventual passing as an excuse to turn back on their heels and revert to the old oppressive systems of kufr, ignorance, and exploitation, what exactly is the outcome?
Well, the cynical answer is that they just go back to the way things were, business as usual.
Yeah.
But from a systemic standpoint, they're actively dismantling their own machinery.
Yes. And the phrasing in the source material is vital here. The text points out that by abandoning the meritocratic system, they are not harming God.
Oh, that's interesting.
God's objective physical laws, the Deen, remain completely untouched. Gravity doesn't stop, buoyancy still functions. What they're doing by reverting to an unjust, exploitative society is solely orchestrating their own catastrophic socioeconomic ruin.
They're ruining their own ROI.
Exactly. They become, in the language of the text, the ultimate losers.
Because God doesn't need your economy to function. You need your economy to function. The rumor at Uhud is the ultimate litmus test. Are you following the man, or are you executing the blueprint? If it's the latter, then leadership transitions must be entirely institutionalized. The Nizami Ribbiyyun has to function continuously, flawlessly, transferring executive power so that the system of universal sustenance doesn't miss a beat just because a biological life ended.
It is a masterclass in demanding institutional continuity over charismatic dependence. But the text doesn't just address the macro-political philosophy here. It also zooms in on the micro-tactics of the soldiers currently fighting that battle.
Really? Like battlefield tactics?
Yes. Parwez re-examines specific battlefield terminology from these verses, stripping away the traditional passive definitions and revealing a highly sophisticated military and strategic lexicon.
Okay, let's do a deep dive into those specific linguistic shifts because this completely changes how you read the text. Let's start with the word seber.
Okay, seber.
Because in conventional religious dialogue, I almost always hear seber translated as patience. And not just patience, but a very passive, enduring kind of suffering. The idea that if you're being oppressed or beaten down, you should just exhibit saber, sit quietly, don't complain, and wait for divine vindication in the afterlife.
Which, again, plays perfectly into the hands of the fatalists and the oppressors. Just sit idly while waiting for divine help.
Right. Don't rebel. Just have saber.
But rationally, when you apply this term to a military engagement like the Battle of Uhud or to high-level statecraft, translating saber as passive suffering is strategically suicidal.
It makes no sense on a battlefield.
None. In Parwez's framework, saber means the exact opposite. It means unwavering steadfastness. It is active, aggressive perseverance. It is the robust psychological resilience required to maintain systemic structure under immense hostile pressure.
So a person exhibiting saber, isn't someone crying quietly in a corner accepting their fate?
Definitely not.
A saber is the soldier in the trench holding the defensive line when the flank is collapsing. It's the engineer staying at their post to keep the power grid online during a hurricane.
Precisely. It is structural integrity under duress, and Parwez highlights how the text defines saber by contrasting it with what it is not.
Okay, what is it not?
Saber is the active refusal to succumb to three specific systemic failures. First is wahan, which is a psychological loss of morale, a defeatist mindset that infects a group before the physical battle is even lost.
Okay, wahan is losing the mental game.
Right. Second is dauf, which is a physical weakness, a lack of material preparation or poor logistics.
Losing the physical game.
Yes. And third is istakanu, which literally means to lay down your arms, to capitulate, or to surrender to the enemy.
That is infinitely more empowering than just patience. To have saber means you have audited your logistics so you don't suffer duff, you maintain psychological discipline so you don't fall to wahan, and you absolutely refuse istakana surrender. It is tactical resilience.
And this tactical language extends further. The source material brings up two more terms that are typically translated very softly, israf and huzn.
Right, israf and huzn. Usually israf is translated as extravagance or wastefulness, like buying a car you can't afford or throwing away good food. And huzn is almost universally translated as beauty, aesthetics, or just general goodness.
Right.
How do those apply to the fog of war at huzn?
Well, in a strategic, systemic context, israf means a severe tactical miscalculation. It means losing your strategic balance.
Okay.
In military terms, israf is overcommitting your vanguard, overextending your supply lines beyond their capacity, or reacting to a feint and throwing your formation out of alignment. Is spending too much of your tactical capital and destabilizing the system.
So it's a failure of proportion. You wasted your resources by deploying them poorly.
Exactly. And huz, therefore, isn't just about something looking pretty.
No, I imagine not.
Huzn in statecraft and strategy means exact calculated proportion. It is the maintenance of perfect dynamic equilibrium.
Perfect equilibrium.
Yes. Following the crisis at Uhud, the system demands that the mar'az and the community conduct a rigorous self-audit. They must identify where the israf occurred, where did we break formation, where did we lose discipline, and they must immediately recalibrate their tactics to restore hus, that perfect systemic balance.
So the text is essentially demanding an institutional after-action report.
That's exactly what it is.
It's forcing them to analyze their failures objectively, rather than just chalking a military defeat up to God's mysterious will. They lost ground at Uhud because of israf tactical errors, not because God arbitrarily removed their sawab dunya.
Exactly. And this rigorous auditing of cause and effect on the battlefield perfectly sets the stage for the ultimate overarching scientific principle of Parwez's entire framework, the grand equation that governs everything we've talked about today.
Right. We've talked about the physics engine, the economic ROI, the necessity of justice, and the tactical resilience required to maintain it all. And all of these subroutines are governed by one universal, inescapable law, Makafati Amal.
The law of requital.
The law of requital.
Makafati Amal is the engine of social physics. Now, usually when people talk about consequences in the context of sacred texts, the immediate assumption is supernatural vengeance.
Right. Fire and brimstone raining down from the sky, floods wiping out cities because an anthropomorphic deity is emotionally angry that a population broke a rule.
It's the punitive lightning bolt model of divine justice.
Which is very common.
But under the rationalist framework, the law of requital is entirely devoid of emotion. It is a scientific, unavoidable consequence of social conduct.
So no lightning bolts.
No lightning bolts. It is the sociological equivalent of Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction.
Okay.
Every single ounce of physical, intellectual, or social effort, whether positive or negative, yields a mathematically precise consequence in the physical world.
Is the ultimate guarantor of the sawab we discussed earlier. But let's apply this law of requital to the fatalistic society we envisioned earlier.
Let's do it.
Because what if a society chooses not to engage in active evil, but merely chooses extreme passivity? They don't murder, they don't steal, they just sit back, rely on jab fatalism, refuse to study the physical laws, and spend all day engaged in passive rituals.
Right.
They believe they are incredibly pious. What is their makafati amal? Do they get a divine bailout because they were technically devout?
The source text is brutally, uncompromisingly clear on this. There is no divine bailout.
None.
None. Inaction is itself an action that yields a consequence. If a society refuses to use its intellect to conquer nature, the law of requital dictates a very specific historical outcome.
Which is?
They will simply be subjugated, colonized, or economically enslaved by a nation that did choose to scientifically exploit the physical laws.
That is terrifyingly objective. The universe does not reward passive piety with physical dominance. If you don't build the infrastructure, you will be crushed by those who do, regardless of how often you pray.
Because you didn't put in the investment, so the law of requital dictates you receive zero ROI.
But let's look at the other side of the equation. How does this law apply to internal social stability? Because the source material specifically brings up the concept of murder. And it frames it not just as a moral sin, but as a systemic catastrophe.
Yes, and this is where Parwez ties biological survival directly to economic and legal justice. In this framework, an unjust murder is not merely categorized as an individual crime or a personal moral failing between two people.
Right.
It is viewed as an act that mathematically destroys the foundational systemic security of all humanity.
How so? Walk me through the systemic logic of that, because
Wow.
destroying all humanity sounds like hyperbole, but I know in this framework it's literal.
It is literal. Think about the entire architecture we've discussed. The sole purpose of the Markaz and the Nizami Rubaiyat is to guarantee the sawab, the ROI, and the biological safety, the ajal of every citizen through the application of adl justice.
Right, the social contract.
If an unjust killing is tolerated, or if the justice system fails to address it equitably, the foundational premise of the social contract crumbles.
Because the implicit promise of the state that your physical life is protected so you can exert labor and earn your return is broken.
Exactly. If you are dead, or if you live in constant terror of arbitrary violence, the ROI becomes entirely meaningless.
So a single unpunished murder introduces a catastrophic bug into the software. It proves the system cannot protect its fundamental unit, the human life.
And if the basic biological security is compromised, the economic engine stops.
Right. People stop investing, they stop laboring, they start hoarding resources out of fear, and the society inevitably slides toward Wahan psychological defeatism and ultimate collapse.
Precisely. Therefore, the inverse is also true. Saving a life or upholding the absolute sanctity of justice in the face of violence isn't just a heartwarming good deed. It is an act that actively reinforces the survival of the entire social order. A society's survival is not magically guaranteed. It is biologically and sociologically tied directly to its strict execution of justice. Oppression and violence create instability, Israf, which mathematically guarantees systemic collapse under the law of requital. Justice creates equilibrium husn, which guarantees long-term sustainability, swabul akira. It is an incredibly tight, closed-loop architecture of cause and effect.
It is a stunningly cohesive worldview. And honestly, we have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of ground today.
We really have.
Let's take a moment to synthesize the journey we've just taken.
Yeah.
Because we started by identifying the ritual trap, that deeply ingrained habit of engaging with ancient texts solely for passive comfort, treating them as mystical placeholders that demand absolutely nothing from our intellect.
But by applying Allama Parwez's rationalist lens to Surah Al-Imran, we've watched that placeholder transform into a rigorous, scientifically grounded civilizational blueprint.
We have transitioned from a universe of micromanaged arbitrary miracles to a cosmos governed by hidden, unbreakable, conquerable physical laws.
We've seen how human mortality, ajal, isn't a fatalistic, pre-written expiration date used by autocrats to keep us docile, but a biological reality that we are commanded to extend and improve through public health and scientific mastery.
And we've redefined sawab from useless ethereal currency to hard, tangible return on investment, forming the basis of a meritocratic economic engine that demands strict justice to avoid collapse.
Right, and we've examined the ultimate stress test at the Battle of Uhud, learning that true constitutional continuity requires a social contract bound to permanent principles, the Deen, rather than the fragile biology of a charismatic leader.
And we've learned that true saber isn't passive suffering, but the aggressive, tactical resilience required to maintain systemic equilibrium Hussein under the unyielding law of requital.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
It really is. And as we wrap up, we have to connect this massive systemic audit back to you, the listener. Because, as we often say, analyzing historical philosophy is intellectually stimulating, but knowledge only achieves its true value when it is understood and applied to your reality.
Exactly.
This framework is a direct challenge to how you operate in the modern world. It invites you to ruthlessly audit your own life. When things go wrong in your community, your career, or your government, how often do you retreat into the ritual trap?
How much do you rely on fate or mysterious plans versus actively analyzing the raw cause and effect that led to the failure?
Right. It challenges you to demand more from your societal structures. Are you demanding institutional continuity and strict meritocracy from your leaders, or are you falling into the trap of personality worship?
When faced with systemic injustice, are you seeking passive comfort, or are you engaging in the active, steadfast resilience of Sabre to hold the line and demand a fair return on investment for everyone?
It forces a complete ground-up reevaluation of your own agency. But this also leaves us with a massive lingering question, a cliffhanger of sorts, based on everything we've established today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we have definitively stated that a society achieves worldly dominance, sawab dunya, solely by mastering the physical laws, the Ayat. And we've stated they achieve long-term survival through the moral laws of justice.
Yes.
But what actually happens, when a community possesses the perfect moral blueprint, the ultimate constitutional framework for economic justice, but they entirely, willfully abandon the scientific subjugation of nature.
What happens when they fiercely memorize the Deen but completely refuse to learn the Ayat?
Exactly.
That is the exact question that bridges the gap between historical decline and the potential for future revival. Because having the most perfect blueprint in the world doesn't build the house if you refuse to pick up the hammer and understand the physics of the nails.
The blueprint is useless without the engineering.
Exactly. And we will explore exactly how a society reclaims its lost scientific agency, how it shakes off the remnants of fatalism, and the brutal consequences of ignoring the physical universe in the next installment of this series.
I absolutely cannot wait to dive into that. It promises to be just as paradigm shifting as today's discussion. Until then, I strongly encourage you to step outside and look at the world around you a little differently. Try not to view it as a series of random, fated events happening to you, but rather as a brilliant, mathematically predictable system of cause and effect, just waiting for you to master it.